Mara pressed the brass scraper down into the ledger and heard the soft rasp as ink lifted from paper. 3 rows away, a fingertip slid along the gap in the cell door and stopped when the sound met the prisoner's ear. Fear sat behind Mara's ribs the way cold metal sits behind a keyhole, present, specific, and ready to be turned. The warden counted his fingers once, then twice, and said, "Begin." Mara began. The scraping was a precise motion she had practiced in sleepless nights. Angle the blade, catch the edge of the old ink, remove the loop of a name without tearing paper, then brush away the residue with a dry rag. That single action, performed under a guttering candle, was the central problem of the night. If the name vanished cleanly, the man in the cell could be treated as if he had never existed. Mara felt fear, then a short, bright doubt. Did she follow Elias's ritual exactly, or did she risk leaving a trace? She steadied her hand. She was 38, her hair pulled back into a low bun, sleeves rolled, ink already staining the tips of her fingers. The ledger lay open on the table between 2 candles. The cell bars cast thin vertical lines across the page. Warden Elias Moro stood behind her, coat collar up, jaw set, the tiny brass seal at his belt catching the candle's light. The prisoner inside the cell, number 13, a gaunt man with a faint tattoo on his wrist, pressed his fingertip against the narrow slit of the door and watched the line where his name curled in looping script. The scraping paused when Mara's hand hesitated. Elias, do it with the measured cadence he used when signing orders. His voice was not loud. It needed no volume. The prisoner swallowed and moved his fingertip across the wood as if mapping a coastline. The ledger had become a weapon. For decades, the colonial registry had been the instrument that turned people into entries and entries into non-existence. Elias treated that ledger like blueprints. He spoke of protocol, of plausible deniability of the paper trail. Mara listened and followed. Yet that night her hands remembered a different thing. A folded scrap of paper slid into a hollowed page earlier by a prisoner who stunk of damp linen and old blood. That scrap made Mara tilt away from procedure in a way that would shape every choice to follow. Elias watched her fingers, then tapped the ledger with 2 knuckles. "Mara," he said, "once you remove the name, you burn the scrap. You scrape, you seal, you file the amendment, nothing more." Understood. He counted the steps with fingers before each word, as if ticking off columns in his head. Mara heard the ritual in the cadence and replied, "Understood, Elias." Her voice was close to a whisper, but steady. She kept her eyes on the loop of the victim's name. The prisoner pressed his forehead against the bars and mouthed, "Please," but his lips were thin and useless. They performed the ceremony. Mara scraped, ink bunched, then came away in a dark powder. She flattened the page and Elias set the tiny brass seal into a wet dab of wax. The wax took the impression of his insignia and of the ledger's corner. A visiting magistrate had requested a roll call at dawn and Elias wanted his answers to look impeccable. That was the pragmatic explanation Elias offered when he later met the magistrate in the office. "A clerical correction," he said. The magistrate nodded and did not rid the ledger close enough to see the hairline groove where letters had been lifted. Before dawn, when Mara carried the ledger back to the shelves, the prisoner slid his hidden scrap into a hollowed sheet with fingers that trembled in the dark. That small act was an attempt to anchor a name to a physical thing. He folded a line of words and tucked them as a person hides a photo. Mara saw the movement when she walked along the corridor to the archive. A quick slip, the way someone breathes when they have a secret. She might have ignored it. Instead, a pattern of emotion pushed at her, fear of being complicit, and then a sparking anger at what she had been trained to call maintenance. That anger moved through her like a decision. She stayed later than usual and watched the ledger until the candle guttered, and the prisoner hummed a thin lullaby against the wall. Mara had spent years convincing herself that she was neutral. She herself, neutrality kept her alive. When a man died in a distant cell, she told herself that removing his name preserved order. But that night neutrality sat uneasy on her chest. She picked up the ledger and opened it. The hollowed sheet took her finger and guided it to the scrap. The scrap was folded so many times that its edges had softened. Mara slipped it between the pages and felt something like recognition. No, not recognition. A precise shock of evidence. She did not burn it then. She tucked it into her torn glove instead and walked out carrying the ledger as if nothing had happened. Elias noticed her pause. He included that observation in his tally later when he said, "You are careful, Mara, but not careless." He did not look for the scrap in her glove. He could have. Instead, he continued to instruct. He had used the ledger to erase men whose names inconvenienced governors and magistrates. He had convinced himself that by erasing them he had prevented greater disorder. He believed plausible deniability worked like a surgical stitch. Cut the wound and the body would knit over it. Mara thought of stitches and of the way a body can go septic when a stitch hides the rot. Her second emotion shift came as a low, steady clarity, doubt sliding into resolve. When the magistrate arrived at dawn, he smelled of boiled leather and government. He for a roll call. The guard flipped the ledger with a gloved thumb and read names in a flat, official voice. Elias watched the magistrate's eyes pass over a blank line. "There is a gap here," the magistrate said, tapping with a ringed finger. Elias did not fumble. He offered a phrase that was all the system needed, an administrative omission, a transfer recorded. The magistrate accepted it and moved on. He Elias about quotas and the ledger's indexing, and Elias gave precise answers. Numbers, dates, signatures. The magistrate nodded and left with no further questions. On the corridor, when the guards returned to what they called routine, a different conversation began. A guard found a torn glove caught in a narrow seam of a shelf, a torn glove with fresh ink on it. He carried it to Elias and announced the find in a voice tuned to accusation. "Warden, this glove was in the archive where it shouldn't be." Elias examined the glove with a dry, small smile that did not reach his eyes. "Mara's gloves," he said slowly. "Bring her." That is how accusation became a formal event. Mara felt the room tilt toward consequence. Her body reacted. Palms slick, breath shorter, fingers flexing at the seam of her apron. Her third emotion shift arrived here. Alarm, then a clinical calculation. She chose to act. In the inventory corridor, Mara met Elias and the guard with the glove on a wooden tray. The guard set the tray down and pointed. "Ink," he it as a fact. Elias did not raise his voice. "Mara, explain." She unbuttoned her cuff with 2 deliberate movements and let the glove hang between her fingers. "My gloves tear easily," she said. "I fix them. I use them for handling paper." The ink. She looked at Elias and then at the tray. "Ink is from my work." Her voice did not break. She counted words like columns on a page. Elias moved closer and spoke low enough that only she could hear. "You understand the rules, Mara. We do not keep contraband. You will show me your satchel." He counted his fingers again. Mara felt her throat close. The satchel was leather and contained the tiny brass scraper he had once given her for maintenance. It also had the scrap folded into a lining. She could hand it over and watch it burn, or she could hide it and risk a greater search. Mara made a choice that revealed who she had become. She opened the satchel and let Elias see the ledger key, the monocle, the brass scraper, and nothing else. He reached inside and found the satchel lighter than expected. The search continued. Guards lifted the satchel and turned it inside out. The scrap did not fall free. The guard's eyes slid across the lining and found a hairline of dark under a stitch. Elias took a breathing moment and then, in front of the corridor, in front of the guards and the prisoner who had been brought to watch, he said, "Mara, you will perform the official deletion in the ledger. You will remove the name in front of us." He set the ledger on an iron stand and pushed it toward the open corridor like an altar. This was the climax Elias had framed, public, ceremonial, irreversible. Mara's hands shook when she approached. The prisoner, number 13, was brought forward and made to sit on a stool facing the ledger. The guards pushed his wrists up, showing the faint tattoo. Elias folded his hands and spoke to both of them with that leisurely calm. "This is procedure," he said. "You will witness the record." The prisoner looked at Mara and said, in a voice that scraped like gravel, "Mara, you promised me." His words broke on the bars of the room. Mara answered with a short, human sentence. I will not lie to you now, that line came from a place in her that had stopped counting steps and had started to measure consequences. She lifted the scraper. She began to work the exact angle Elias had taught her. Ink rose in a powder, then she brushed it with a rag. The action was clinical. The emotion was delivered in small physical details, the tightened jaw, the way her thumb left an ink print on the rag, the way the prisoner watched the line where his name had been. Guards stood close enough to smell the candle wax, and the prisoner's breath. The magistrate's earlier acceptance of a blank line made the ritual feel official. The file folder would later carry a stamped note, and the chain of custody would appear unbroken. But as Mara scraped, she felt the presence of the hidden scrap in her satchel like a small animal under a lid. She was conscious of two timelines: the visible ledger that would be shown to officials, and the secret folded paper that might preserve a name. When the last loop of ink came away, Elias nodded and pressed his brass seal into the warm wax. He looked satisfied. He turned to the prisoner and recited a line. By order and record, the registry reflects transfer or removal from service. The prisoner breathed and a small sound left him, neither scream nor relief. He walked back to his cell with hands that shook but head lifted in a different way. There was a new resolve in the angle of his shoulders, as if the act of being erased had given him the clarity of someone who now had nothing left to lose. Mara left the ledger open and on impulse slid her hand beneath her fingernail. There she had tucked, without thinking, a microscopic sliver of the scraped ink under the edge. It lodged at the corner like a tiny fossil. She walked away with that shard hidden and with the scrap still in her satchel. She did not speak as she moved. She folded her hands so they would not betray the weight of what she carried. The guards returned to their posts. The corridor smelled of candle smoke and wet stone. Elias watched her with a slow menace and then turned back to his papers. After the deletion, events accelerated. The guard who had found the torn glove brought a second discovery. A notation in the ledger margin, scrawled in someone else's hurried hand, which suggested the erased man had once used another name in the colonial office. That notation changed the stakes. The magistrate's acceptance of a blank line no longer insulated the wardens. Now there was a link between someone in the archive and an office high enough to raise consequences outside the prison walls. Elias gathered the ledger and left with the note tucked under his arm. "We will make the file complete," he told Mara without looking at her. "We will secure plausible deniability." The phrase was a command and a promise. Mara felt the second twist unspool. The erased man might carry information that could expose people beyond their prison, names and ledger entries that connected to appointments and payments. That possibility made the ledger more dangerous than a simple tool of order. Mara's fear shifted again, this time to a sharp, practical fear. If someone higher noticed an inconsistency, the clean erasures she had made could be opened and examined. She had kept the scrap. That scrap could become proof or a weapon. A decision pressed on her like a thumb on paper. She left the archive later that day with the satchel heavier than when she had come. Fear moved in her as she walked. Fear, then a quick flare of guilt, then a narrowing resolution. She found the prisoner in his cell and slipped a folded scrap of bread through the bars with one hand while the other kept the satchel's strap. The prisoner looked at the bread, then at her, then at the seam of her sleeve. "Mara," he said, "why did you?" She touched the gap in his wrist where the faded tattoo curled. "Because you tried to leave a name," she said. "Because I saw it. Because I hid it." He laughed once, a dry sound. "They call me number 13. He tapped the ink on his wrist. "I have been called worse. If they pull my name through their machines and find nothing, they will sleep fine. If someone finds your scrap, they will not sleep at all." He cuffed and leaned his forehead against the bars. "Leave whatever you can," he said. "If you can shout my name, hide it." Mara nodded. That exchange tightened her shoulders. She left him a piece of cloth with a faint smear of ink and walked back to the archive where a guard watched the shelves. She felt the weight of two lives in her satchel, the secret paper and the shard under her nail. That night, alone in the archive back room, Mara sat at a narrow desk and opened the satchel. She set the scrap on the wood and lifted the reading monocle to her eye. The scrap bore a name that belonged to someone who had once signed official orders in a different hand. The ink had smudged in one corner, but a ledger stamp was faintly legible. Mara realized the person she had helped to remove had been registered under a different identity in the regional office. The discovery changed the ledger from instrument to threat. She felt a new emotion, a tight, restless vigilance that made her sit straighter. This was an emotion shift from resolve to furtive calculation. The next morning, a guard accused her of hiding contraband. Mara stood before Elias and the guards again, and there was a short argument in which names were called and voices rose. The back and forth lasted 5 short lines. "You hid something," the guard said. "Mara, show the satchel." "Elias, I did not hide anything for myself," Mara replied. "Then whose name did you try to protect?" "Elias, that is none of your business." "Mara, it is our ledger." Elias shot back. "We keep records." The room pulsed with the sound of the ledger's pages being turned. Elias' posture hardened. "You misstepped, Mara," he said. "This is not preservation. This is interference." The exchange put everything on a knife edge. Guards looked to each other. The prisoner observed with hollow eyes. Mara's choices had forced a confrontation. She placed both hands flat on the table and said, "No. I kept proof." Her voice carried the facts like a ledger entry. "I kept proof that someone existed." Her line was thin, not rhetorical. It changed how the group read her. They had expected confession, perhaps, or a plea. Instead, she offered a fact and nothing else. Elias considered that fact. He could have ordered a search and burned the scrap, or he could have used it to shift blame. He smiled with his mouth closed and then, in a quieter tone, said, "You will stay in the archive. You will not speak of this to anyone." It was a sentence that resembled punishment and protection at once. Mara understood the calculation. Keep the keeper quiet and the ledger safe. She obeyed. But in the weeks that followed, she began a quiet, exact work. She made faint pencil copies of ledger headings on scrap paper and slipped them under floorboards. She traced ink letters with a pin and preserved the strokes that were supposed to vanish. The prisoner, number 13, started a ritual of his own. Every night he pressed his fingertip to the bars and traced invisible letters on his palm that he later taught others in whispers. 2 people could remember one thing if they both touched it at the same moment. The acts were small and concrete. Pencils, pressed palms, hidden tags. The scale of their work was tiny compared to the ledger, but the details mattered. They were tangible attempts to resist erasure. One evening, as Mara folded a thin copy into a hollowed book, a new officer arrived at the gate. He spoke with the clipped, efficient tone of someone who had read the ledger's indexes and wanted accuracy. For a list of transfers, Elias presented a clean set of files. The new officer did not notice the microscopic evidence hidden in Mara's desk. He left nodding. For Mara, that moment confirmed the ledger's effectiveness. A well-placed blank can keep a bureaucrat from asking questions. Her last action in the chapter was small and concrete. She slid the microscopic sliver of scraped ink from beneath her nail into a folded scrap and hid it in the seam of her satchel, where a man might later look for a small tool. Outside the archive, the prisoner hummed a fragment of a lullaby he had used to keep his memory. Mara heard it through the door and felt a strange kinship with the line of melody. She closed the ledger, placed it on the shelf where Elias would find it neat, and walked away with both a hidden paper and a hidden shard. The chapter closed on a concrete beat. A guard's knock on the archive door, 3 measured taps, the sound itself an action that would either bring accusation or delay. Mara sat down and waited for the knock to be answered. The knock arrived. She moved to open the door as the candle smoke curled in a thin line and the prison air pressed on the hinges. The question she had to live with, whether the scrap would be found, whether the ledger would be opened by someone who knew what to read, remained unresolved but bounded. The immediate conflict of the chapter, the deletion performed in public, and the hidden proof kept by a reluctant archivist, had reached a concrete endpoint. The ledger showed a blank line, the prisoner returned to his cell, and Mara carried a secret that might one day expose the ledger's truth. The knock on the door was the chapter's final beat. A new event would follow, and the choices Mara had made would demand an answer. Guards shoved a hooded prisoner from the cart into the intake courtyard, while Mara's hand hovered over the brass scraper on the ledger table. Suspicion tightened Mara's shoulders. She had felt the ledger being softened, altered, and rehearsed before, and that feeling pushed her to watch the first stroke. The warden checked the seal and pointed at the prisoner without speaking. The ledger's pages waited open under the candle, a thin line of fresh ink still drying where Mara had once seen names relisted and then removed. Mara had pressed the brass scraper into paper before. She remembered the rasp of metal against fiber from the last time she worked under the warden's gaze. That memory fed the suspicion now. It moved her to step closer. She rested her gloved hand on the satchel at her hip and counted with her fingers once, twice. Each count shaped her motion. A guard barked, name and number. Now Warden Elias Moro did not raise his voice. He counted the syllables as if auditing a ledger. Register him. Full name first. Mara set her monocle in place and bent so the candlelight struck the page. Her breath fogged the margin. Her fingers did not shake outward. They curled around the pen with practiced steadiness. This is where the conflict stood. Write the name to acknowledge the prisoner, then remove it to make the state's denial possible. If she did not write, the warden would press her for reasons. If she wrote, she would hold a mark that could break the erasure. She wrote the name in slow strokes, the ink pooled slightly on the downstroke. The warden watched with a neutral face. Guards kept their hands on the hooded man's shoulders. Mara's suspicion shifted to a quiet fear as she felt the weight of the ledger's potential in her gloves. When the brass scraper came down, the sound was soft but precise. The name went white under the edge of the metal. The hooded prisoner's shoulders slumped as if some muscle had been released. The opening scene fastened the problem. The institution made people vanish by erasing names and then eradicating their traces. That was the architecture Mara had first noted in ragged folios months ago. She had reported anomalies to junior clerks and sifted water, ruined pages while the warden called such losses unavoidable. The ledger's neat blanks now matched an intake witnessed by 3 guards and 1 warden. The concrete stake was clear, an official denial of existence paired to a physical removal from maps and rolls. Mara's background pressed against the action. She had learned cataloging under a provincial archivist who insisted on precise page numbers and durable bindings. She had been hired because she could stabilize water, damaged folios with a single lamp and a steady hand. That skill put her close to the ledger. Her posture remained upright from years at the table. She treated each page as if repair mattered. That orientation to order directed her next moves. They took the hooded man to a holding pen. Mara followed, ostensibly to seal the intake note. The courtyard smelled of wet straw and cold iron. A guard said, "Leave the satchel, Lennox." "We'll handle registration now." Mara's voice stayed low. "I need the ledger open in case the seal is questioned." She put the satchel on the table but kept her fingers on the worn leather edge. Suspicion hardened into a second emotion shift, from suspicion into quiet defiance. She had no plan yet, only the certainty that carrying out the ritual without record would mean another human erased forever. In the early morning, Mara and a junior clerk, Thomas, walked the archive corridor with lamp smoke in the air. They were looking for missing folios. Thomas tapped a stitched spine and found a section where signatures had been gouged out and the sheet resealed with thread. "Thomas, Mara, mark that folio." "We'll need to cross," referenced the intake rolls. Thomas frowned and pointed. "See this pattern? Same prickle of removing, same stitching. It's deliberate." His voice carried the raw edge of surprise. The discovery supplied a new external event and forced Mara to translate suspicion into method. She pulled a pair of torn gloves from her satchel and set to work charting the pattern. Mara examined the stitched folio with a lens. The thread ran in straight measured passes. She allowed, the cuts were made before the restitching. Whoever did it used the same tool each time. Thomas frowned again and said, "Who would risk the ledger?" Mara closed her mouth. She compared the scrape marks with the brass scraper she kept as part of her tools. The grooves matched. When she returned to the warden's office later that morning, Elias Moro slid a sealed order across the desk and laid out the phrase, "Prepare uncatalogued folios for disposal in an even pen stroke." He counted aloud as he tapped the paper, 10 entries tonight, Mara, remove the named pages. Burn them, he spoke like an administrator reading inventory. Mara's jaw tightened. Elias, which folios are uncatalogued? He did not look up the ones that displaced the account of order. Sanitation, Elias demonstrated the ritualized method. He placed a page under the lamp and held the brass seal to the margin before directing Mara to scrape names. His hands were deliberate. Each motion matched the steps she had catalogued in the archives. It must look practiced, he said. People remember practice. People obey practice. His calm voice pressed pressure into the room. Mara felt an internal sag of dread as she realized the ritual theater was meant to discipline witnesses. Her suspicion swelled into fear. She counted the sequence of his motions and recorded them mentally. Write, show, scratch, fold, burn. Mara's decision point arrived that afternoon in the conservation alcove. She was repairing a folio ruined by water when her lamp revealed an underlayer of fresh ink beneath the scraped surface. The name there was clear and proper. She paused, fingers over the page, and listened to the building's distant clamor, footfalls on stairs and the scrape of chain links. She could hand the page to Elias and Aquaius, or she could hide it. Her breathing tightened. The shift from fear to resolve began. She folded the fragment into her palm and slid it into the satchel. The action was small and precise. She did not speak. No one noticed the movement in the crowded quiet. That theft converted her suspicion into an active choice. When she closed the satchel, she rehearsed the numbers of the order in her head to keep the sound of the brass scraping from echoing her intent. That night Elias summoned Mara to the locked ledger chamber. He closed the heavy door behind them and let a single candle smoke. "You will expunge this register as I command," he said. His voice held the same merciless calm it always did. He handed her a fresh folio and the brass scraper. She set the hidden fragment beneath her sleeve to avoid its discovery. The warden watched the motion and counted as she moved. The tension rose with every measured pass of the scraper. Their exchange became a confrontation. "Elias, Mara, short and steady, you asked me to remove them. I will follow procedure." He leaned closer. "You know the procedure, Mara." "Perform it." He recited the steps, each syllable a rifled note. Mara placed the pen on the page and wrote a false flourish in the margin to mimic her habit. Her hand then moved the scraper across the names as he watched. She performed the motion required, but swapped the page in the ledger with the hidden fragment when his back turned for a beat to fetch more lamp oil. Elias' eyes narrowed. The change in her action triggered a rapid exchange between them. "You moved." "Elias, I moved to improve legibility." Mara replied, "Do not patronize me, Mara." "Tell me, please." "I will do as ordered," she said, and she let her voice fall flat to hide the tremor in her pulse. They traded 3 quick lines like that, each line a test. The warden watched for a slip. Mara kept her face neutral while her fingers did the theft under the ledger's weight. That back and forth satisfied the requirement for a tight, rapid confrontation. It also pushed Mara into the chapter's climax, forced expunction under threat. Mara left the ledger chamber with a folded register that had a blank row where a name had been. Elias closed the ledger with a soft press and placed it back on the shelf, satisfied. The building's routine resumed, yet Mara had the fragment under her sleeve and the shape of a plan sharpening in her mind. She had converted suspicion and fear into an actionable lie against the system. Before dawn, Mara arranged a laundry exchange with practiced motions. She placed linens into the basket and tucked the fragment into a seam. The forgotten, once called number 13 by the warders, worked the laundry detail at that hour. He found the scrap while wringing a strip of linen. He froze when he read the full name on the damp paper and mouthed it once, slowly. The forgotten whispered, "This is my name." His voice was thin but precise. He held the paper with shaking fingers and read again. Mara's presence in the doorway was small and frameless. She watched him learn he still had a proper name. The prisoner looked up at her and said, "Mara." 2 sentences later, he said, they took it from the ledger. Why? Mara crouched and placed her hand near but did not touch the scrap. Because they want to move people where no one will look, she said. She did not offer a plan. The exchange changed something between them. The forgotten straightened as if he had been given actual ballast. At the archive reading table by day, the ledger displayed neat blanked rows. Elias inspected it and nodded. Patrols passed without comment. In public, the system had its cleanliness. In private, Mara kept the scrap between folded linen and a hard absence in her satchel. The forgotten kept the name in his head and scratched it lightly onto the inner rim of his wrist with a fingernail. He hummed a lullaby line under his breath while he did it, a tactile motion that converted the stolen paper into a living mark. Mara's choices brought a set of cascading decisions among other characters. She had Thomas Cross, reference intake dates with the plantation names she had seen in the hidden fragment. Thomas's discovery that a plantation absent from official maps appeared repeatedly in transport manifests provided a surprising reveal. Thomas Mara, read the place out loud. He read the name, stammering the consonants. Elias overheard in the hallway and folded his expression into neutral civility. Do not make accusations, Thomas Elias. The warden's intervention changed the tenor of the search. Thomas swallowed and shut his mouth. A mid-chapter cliffhanger arrived when Thomas produced a ledger page with a notation that matched the handwriting of the sealed order. The notation listed a ledger reference that pointed to a folio already burned by official report. Thomas slammed the page down. They burned it last month, he said. Mara's fingers tightened around the lampstand. That discovery shifted the story. Burned folios meant absolute removal unless another mark survived elsewhere. The cliffhanger forced Mara and Thomas to act. They moved through the archive with a new urgency. Mara ordered Thomas to fetch a pallet of bindings while she searched the back stacks. They found a stitched folio that had been shelved under a different catalogue. Mara eased out the page and found marginalia in a clerk's hand. The marginalia named the warden's operation in dry clerical terms. Uncatalogued transfer to off-map plantation. The handwriting matched Elia's own archival notes from the office demonstration earlier that morning. The concrete reveal altered how Mara now viewed Elias. Not merely an administrator maintaining order, but an architect of systematic erasure. When the forgotten learned the plantation name, his eyes flicked to Mara and he whispered, "If they send us there, they will not send letters. They will not send witnesses." He chewed the inside of his cheek and then used his thumb to trace the name he had carved into his wrist. That action expressed fear through a small bodily detail rather than a statement about feeling. Mara's resolve hardened. The second emotion shift, fear into resolve, nested into this scene. She decided to keep pushing to convert the hidden fragment into a lever. Elias increased surveillance after the ledger chamber incident. Guards checked the archive's door and asked Mara curt questions about binding inventories. She answered with blunt factual sentences and measured pauses. When Elias confronted her with a list of missing pages, she handed back exact counts and suggested auditing steps. He watched the motion and said nothing for a long breath. The tension held, then a surprising turn occurred. A junior clerk, Thomas, approached the laundry yard late and said, "I found this in the ditch behind the burn pit." He held up a charred edge of paper. Mara recognized the fiber and the partial ink. She slid the fragment under her palm without looking. Thomas's face showed that he had expected congratulations. Instead, Mara, burns are not evidence. They are evidence of concealment. Her tone pushed him into a different posture. He nodded and said, "What should we do?" Mara answered with a plan that was mostly practical motions. Copy the names onto a strip. Hide the strip in the seam of the warden's satchel when he drank his midnight tea. And smuggle the ledger fragment out through a laundry exchange. Thomas protested. "We will be caught," Mara replied with 3 short sentences of instruction, and then took the satchel. "If we are caught," she said, "we will have done what we can." The line was not heroic language. It was a concrete trade-off. The climax returned the story to Elias's locked ledger chamber. He summoned her with the air of routine and designated the hour for expunction. She entered with the stolen fragment sewn into her sleeve and the satchel empty where the fake page had been. She placed the brass scraper on the table and began the motion again. Alias counted, and every scrape sounded like arithmetic. The warden's face remained composed. 3 guards stood in the doorway as witnesses. The scene was designed to produce compliance. Mara performed the actions required by the ritual but reversed the sequence at one critical point. She scraped the visible names while her fingers palmed the hidden page. When Elias reached to take the covered folio for burning, Mara's hand slipped a folded page from under the ledger and set it to an open seam in a binding she had prepared earlier. She did it in a single controlled motion. Alias' gaze flicked toward the move, and his voice clipped, "What did you do, Mara?" She answered in 2 short, measured lines. "I repaired the binding as ordered, and it improves longevity." The exposition was minimal. It created immediate tension. Elias moved forward, and their exchange turned sharp. "Stop stalling." "Elias, I am not stalling," Mara answered. "Show me the page." He reached. Mara kept her hand steady and let only a second of hesitation appear. Then she pushed the ledger closed, sliding the replaced folio into the shelf. For a breath, Elias's fingers hovered near the brass edge of the scraper and the ink-stained corner of the ledger. He called for a guard to open the shelf. A guard obeyed and withdrew the volume. The outer folio showed only blanked rows and neat burn marks. Elias's calm did not change. Only a thin crease deepened between his brows. "Very well. I will note this as completed." He closed the shelf and left with his sealed order. The guard followed. Mara exhaled slowly once the door latched. The ledger's throat had been closed, but the hidden page remained sewn into a binding that would not be audited for months. The theft had succeeded for now. The chapter's conflicts had resolved. The register had a blank row, the hidden fragment existed, and the forgotten knew his name. Daylight returned and patrols resumed their rhythm. Mara left the bound folio with Thomas for safekeeping and visited the laundry chamber. She watched the forgotten with the laundry basket and saw him fold the thin strip of paper into his palm. He did not speak much. He hummed a lullaby line while he worked and tapped the carved talisman at his waist with a thumb. That tactile motion converted identity into a small survival tactic. Thomas came to Mara with news. A transport manifest listed multiple men destined for the unlisted plantation, and one name matched the hidden fragment's notation. They moved them at night through the South Road. Mara's hand found the satchel strap. The knowledge demanded a response. She wrote a discreet pencil mark on the margin of a ledger where a clerk might notice but misread it, creating a breadcrumb that might lead an outside inquiry if anyone compared lists. The chapter closed with concrete consequences and not abstract reassurances. The ledger in the archive sat with its blank rows. Alias had the appearance of order. Thomas had a partial rote to follow. The forgotten had his proper name etched on skin. Mara had stolen a page and hidden it inside a binding. She had risked more than a clerical error. She had risked her position. Her decision altered the immediate terrain. A known name now existed outside official record, and a route that once seemed secure now had a marked seam to pull. The final paragraph ends with an action that ties directly to the chapter's events. Mara slipped the bound folio into a narrow crate destined for the repair room and turned the metal latch. The sound of the latch clicked once and carried down the corridor as she tucked the satchel closer and walked away. A guard read the roster and stopped when his voice hit a blank line where a name should be. Suspicion tightened the corridor. Metal keys paused in hands. The guard looked at the ledger, then up at the iron-barred row and called, "Number 13." A hollow answer came from a throat that had learned to answer where a name had vanished. The roll call, held at midnight in the subterranean cell block, became the first loud proof that paper had surrendered people. Mara Lennox heard the guard's voice in the archive above. She tightened her fingers around the brass scraper in the satchel at her hip. Suspicion had lodged under her ribs for weeks. She had felt the ledger soften under the scraper before, and a scraped line in a column now meant absence, not mistake. Mara had once treated records as a living map of duty. Now each erased stroke felt like a measured excision of life. She moved toward the stair, shoulders angled against the cold, clutching the satchel as if it could hold answers. The narrator records the event plainly. During the roll call, a name was missing and a hand reached for the ledger with a final, confirmed motion. That motion mattered because it converted a gap into official absence. Warden Elias Moreau appeared at the cell block door with a key ring that clinked like a sentence. He did not hurry, he walked precisely, the way a man audits a book. "Read the next name," he said. His voice had the cadence of a ledger being closed. The guard swallowed and began again. Earlier that evening, Mara had found a damp fragment tucked between unrelated entries in a register. The fragment still bore smear marks where the brass scraper had lifted ink. She had lifted the scrap with gloved fingers and held it under the candle. The smear had been targeted, several lines were gone in sequence. The missing entries traced to a single barracks. Mara had told no one then. She had carried the scrap between her ribs and the satchel like contraband. The cold roll call discovery forced an immediate decision. Warden Moreau held the ledger at elbow height and slid his finger down a column until his fingertip stopped at a faint curve where ink once had been. He exhaled like paper being creased. "Confirmed," he said. He drew the brass seal from his waist and pressed it into the margin. The seal's impression made absence official. The guard's jaw worked. The head guard took a step to the side. In the cell block, a man at the end of the row turned his face and mouthed a name. No one moved to answer. Mara descended into the corridor after him. She moved with the quiet exactness of someone used to counting edges. In the stairwell, she passed a junior clerk with a satchel that smelled of ink and soap. The junior clerk's hands were clean, but his eyes avoided her. "Did you sign the transfer log?" He did not answer immediately. Suspicion sharpened Mara's voice into short, direct demands. The junior clerk finally said, "No, Miss Lennox." "Not today." Mara watched his fingers. They were steady. They hid nothing in their steadiness, but they also kept nothing. They returned to the archive vault later that night. The vault smelled of cold stone, wax, and old glue. Mara opened the register and slid the damp fragment onto the table. Junior Clerk Thomas leaned over it, thumb worrying the edge. "It was wet when I found it," he said. "It looked like someone tried to scrub the ink." Mara's mouth pressed thin. She set the brass scraper on the ledger like a needle. Mara had used the scraper before. She knew its sound. Thomas watched her fingers. His legs were both a question and a decision. "Who touched this?" "Mara." She kept the sentence short. Thomas answered, "No one in records, I think. The intake men had it when they passed the ledger." Mara lifted her head. "The intake men brought who?" she asked. Thomas looked away. "Hooded prisoners." The usual that evening's discovery reactivated an earlier scene in memory. Guards had shoved a hooded prisoner from the cart into the intake courtyard, while Mara's hand hovered over the brass scraper on the ledger table. She had felt then the ledger being softened and rehearsed. She had not expected the pattern to accelerate and aim at a contiguous set of names. Now she held proof. Outside the vault, in a damp shared cell, the forgotten, the man marked by number 13, sat on the mattress and traced names on the wall with his fingertip. He had learned to hold a name with a fingertip because paper would not keep it for him. A cellmate pressed a carved bone talisman into his palm. "Hide it in your sleeve," the cellmate said. "If you cannot keep it inside paper, keep it on your skin." The forgotten's hands trembled. He folded the talisman under the fraying cuff and hummed a lullaby line. His action was a small, stubborn proof against erasure. Mara returned to the stacks later, carrying evidence and a question. She found Warden Moreau where he always worked. Standing by a tall table, ledger open, finger-tracing columns, the warden's pale face was a map of fine lines. He counted with his fingers before he spoke. He tilted his head as if assessing the ledger's grain. "You found a fragment," he said. His voice kept its measured cadence. "The fragment shows sequential deletions in the barracks register, Mara." She placed the fragment in front of him. "They target the same barracks." Her sentence was precise. She had left out no names. She watched him as she spoke. Moreau read the scrap under the candle and did not frown. He folded his hands with a bureaucrat's gentleness. "There is a directive," he said, "an order from colonial office in the capital. They are to sanitize certain registers." Mara's shoulders moved. She did not make a sound that could be called a protest. She held her breath and waited for him to say more. The warden's fingers tapped the ledger rim like punctuation. "Sanitize how?" she asked. Moros' reply was measured. "By removing names that compromise operations." Mara held the words like a living thing. She could see how the warden framed removal as maintenance. She had watched him do this before. Convert people into rows, then into blanks. She understood why he spoke as if auditing rather than commanding. Still, she needed proof and accountability. They argued not with volume but with short, exact lines. "You signed the last transfer." "Mara, I signed what needed signing." "Moro, who authorized the seal?" "Mara, the office sent the order," he said. They traded questions like ledger entries. Thomas watched the exchange from the doorway. He shifted weight from one foot to another and then stepped forward. "Warden, I found a folded scrap today." "Thomas." Someone slipped it into the clerk's satchel. "I thought to hand it in." He paused and looked at Mara. "I hid it for a moment. Then the head guard arrived. I handed it over to him." Mora's eyes narrowed. He took a single step and his shadow fell over the ledger. "You hid it because you feared misplacement would be seen as theft," he said. Thomas's neck reddened. Mara leaned in. "Show me," she said to Thomas. Thomas handed her a small folded paper. The scrap bore a name and a barracks number. Whoever wrote it had done so with a shaky hand. The name was clear enough to keep a life alive. An external event pushed each paragraph forward. The roll call stopped. The fragment was found. The talisman changed hands. Moro issued the directive. Each event raised stakes. Mara felt a second movement inside her that would steer choices. Doubt sliding into fear, then into a brittle resolve. She did not name those feelings. She acted. She set a plan. Mara Thomas to bring her the incoming satchels at dawn. She watched the transfer corridor all night. She timed the guards' footsteps by their shoes. She watched the head guard, who kept his posture like a hinge. When the transfer came before first light, the forgotten bent as if to tie his fraying string. He slipped a folded scrap into a clerk's satchel while the head guard's back was turned. A breath left him sharp and controlled. This was action against erasure. Thomas felt the weight of choice in his palms. He could hand the scrap to Moreau and keep his place, or hide it and risk discovery. He folded the decision into a single movement. In the ledger doorway, he opened the satchel and let the scrap fall into the ledger's binding under the cover. He did not speak, he did not smile. An unexpected reveal changed the direction of the plan. As Thomas turned, head guard Rourke's boot struck metal. He had heard the fall. He looked into the satchel. He looked at Thomas. "What is this?" Rourke demanded. Thomas froze. The transfer corridor felt smaller. The ledger door felt heavier. Rourke's voice snapped short lines. "Thomas, show me." Now, Thomas handed the satchel open. Rourke found the folded scrap and read the name. He held it like a hot coal. Rourke's choice would determine the next scene. He stepped back and said, "Warden." He had turned the scrap into an accusation. The head guard's action removed the private hope from the plan and made it public. That publicness forced a confrontation. They brought the ledger into the central record room at dawn. The record room smelled of boiled glue and wax. Moreau set the ledger on the central table and dragged a candle flame across the margin. He opened it to the relevant page and his finger moved with an auditor's exactness. Thomas, Mara, the head guard, and a knot of clerks assembled around him. The forgotten was dragged in by the guards. He walked with his head down, but his hands gripped the talisman under his sleeve. Mara stepped forward. "This scrap was meant to be entered into the register," she said. Her voice cut across the room. Mora's face showed no flicker. He did not raise his voice. "He who altered the ledger." Thomas answered, "I found it. I placed it inside." The room tightened. Moreau opened the ledger and traced his finger to the blank rows where names had been lifted. He took the brass seal and pressed it into the margin beside the blank. He made the absence permanent on paper and official in the room. "We cannot accept unauthorized entries," he said. The ledger is the only proof we have that the institution stands unbroken. His words framed the ritual. He then performed the ritual. He took a cloth and dampened the affected column. He slid the brass scraper down the lines one by one. Each scrape made a thin rasping sound that beat against the quiet. The forgotten watched with a fixed, raw stare. The scraping removed letters. The candlelight shivered over the pages. Thomas's knuckles whitened around his satchel strap. The room held its breath as ink lifted and the page bled small dark lines. In the middle of the scraping, Moro paused and spoke to Mara in a low, measured voice. "You understand why this happens," he said. "You keep the ledger tidy, Mara." "That is your duty." Mara waited, then said, "My duty is to keep records true." Her words were short. She did not plead. Moro's hand moved again and completed the motion. He closed the ledger. He then issued orders in a detached tone that left no room for argument. Burn the peripheral indexes. Reassign the clerk to intake. Seal the stacks for inspection. The head guard barked a single confirmation. Guards moved. They took bundles of peripheral indexes and carried them to the antechamber. They stacked pages on a tray and set flame to the edges. The fire licked paper and the room smelled of char. Moro watched the fire as if auditing smoke. He assigned Thomas to transfer duty. Thomas' eyes did not meet Mara's. He obeyed. This public ritual broke Mara's last justification. Prior to this night, she had told herself she was a neutral agent, sanitizing records to preserve order. She now watched that neutrality be used to erase a human deliberately. She did not speak immediately. She felt her breath shorten. Doubt gave way to fear, then hardened into a plan. She did not make a show. She acted privately. After the ritual, while the head guards supervised the burning, Mara slipped away to the stacks. She moved between shelves with her hands steady. In the archive's dim corner, she reached into her satchel and found the folded scrap Thomas had given her earlier when she asked him to hide it for a moment. Her fingers found the thin seam between volume and spine. She slid the scrap into the seam and pressed it flat. The action was precise and small. It was a private placement where a name could survive paper and flame. At the same time, the forgotten waited in his cell until dawn's light thinned the mortar beneath his bedstone. He scraped a sharp edge of smuggled flint against the mortar and ground the letters into the stone. The sound was a dry rasp. Blood from a cut finger smeared the carved letters. He spat, wiped his hand on rag, and traced the letters again. The name was now lodged under the bedstone where guards would not look. He breathed and hummed the final lullaby line. His actions made a stubborn claim. Someone had existed. A sudden twist emerged before the chapter closed. Thomas, reassigned to intake, returned to the ledger doorway the following night with a new satchel. He carried himself with a different weight. Mara confronted him in the corridor where the transfer passed. "Thomas," she said, "why did you hand the scrap to Rourke?" He stepped back. "Rourke threatened my family," he said in a single breath. He would strip my name from the rolls and send word if I did not comply. My sister would be shamed on the next list. I chose to save her. The revelation reframed every earlier choice. Thomas had not been cowardly. His compliance had been a bargaining chip. The warden's directive and the head guard's threats formed a chain that forced Thomas into action against his conscience. Mara's short silence folded into a new calculation. She had suspected caution, now she had proof. Mara's response was swift. She placed a folded scrap into Thomas' hand and said, "Keep this in your palm. When you can slip it under the ledger binding again. Do not hand it to Rourke." Her voice left no room for grandstanding. Thomas nodded once. He did not speak. The chapter's climax had already occurred when Moro performed the public ritual of erasure. The emotional peak landed in the record room when the ledger was scraped and the seal pressed, while Thomas and Mara stood within reach of the action. The aftershock produced decisions and small rebellions. The staff reshuffled. The indexes burned. The ledger's margins were scrubbed clean. After that, the staff rearranged records and enforced secrecy. The head guard moved people. Thomas was reassigned. Thomas' reassignment proved both a punishment and a cover for him to keep the hidden scrap safe for another night. The forgotten's carved name under the bedstone and Mara's seam hidden scrap in the ledger were twin acts of defiance. They guaranteed that erasure would be contested in silence. Mara did not celebrate. She kept moving through the archive with a steady gait. She held the knowledge that a name could be removed from paper, but not entirely from human action. She understood that some records would be burned on command. She also understood that buckles, seams, and mortar could hold the truth. The chapter ends not on a grand triumph, but on concrete, connected actions. Mara slid the seam, placed scrap deeper into the book, and closed the ledger with a single index finger. The forgotten ground the final letter into mortar and set the talisman back into his sleeve. Thomas locked a satchel and walked away, eyes hard with the weight of decisions made for family. Mora issued a new list of orders and left the record room with his key ring clicking in cadence. The ledger sat closed on the table with a faint seal in its margin. Someone set the remaining scraps into a small tin and hid it beneath a loose floorboard. The immediate conflict of the chapter, an attempt to enter a name into the official record, and the warden's ritual erasure, reached a clear resolution. The public effort failed, the ritual succeeded, and 2 private acts preserved a name. The narrator ends this chapter on a concrete situational beat. Mara brushed ash from her palm and walked to the stacks. She slipped her hand into the book seam and felt the folded paper's edge beneath her thumb. The forgotten tapped mortar with a scraped fingertip and mouthed the letters he had carved. The sound of the tap was small and precise. It was a claim. It was the story's last visible action in this chapter. Midnight in the registry chamber. Mara snapped the brass scraper from its leather loop and rested the dull edge on the page as Warden Elias Moro ordered the men to lift the bound section out of the shelf. Suspicion tightened Mara's jaw and flattened the rhythm of her breath. She kept her hand where she could feel the ledger's warmth through the table. The room smelled of wet wool and old glue. Guards shifted boots on stone. Elias spoke without raising his voice. "Take that quarter out. Burn the rest after the scrape." Mara moved like someone executing a practiced motion. She slid the satchel aside, unclipped the seal she always carried, and placed it on the table's worn center. She checked the curl of the page with a fingertip and heard the guard at the door clear his throat. The first 120 pages were catalog, bound and folded to hide names. The problem was plain. The ledger contained lives slated for removal, and tonight the ledger would lose the marks that tied the prison to those lives. In the first minutes, the central conflict of the night was obvious and immediate. The registry chamber had been sealed on Warden Elias' order. A roster had already been folded into a satchel for the head guard. That roster was the instrument of plausible deniability. Mara's motions were small and exact. Her scraper had scraped names before. She had heard the soft rasp of ink leaving paper in this same room in an earlier purge. She had handled the brass scraper in Chapter 1 when she first felt the ledger being softened and rehearsed. Now she had to decide whether to follow a ritual she had performed many times, or to hide one name she had learned to care for enough to keep. Suspicion moved Mara to examine the scrap that had been smuggled to her earlier that night. A junior guard had found it half tucked beneath a mattress and brought it to the ledger alcove. The fragment showed a faded name and the intake marks that matched a hollowed pen stroke Mara recognized. The guard, named Harris, stood near the alcove and watched her with the wary posture of a man who had delivered bad news. "Mara." Harris, voice low. This fell from 13's cell. Mara looked at the scrap, then at the ledger. She folded the scrap into the palm of her hand without showing the edges. "Leave it here," she said. "I'll check it before the scrape." Harris' eyes flicked to Elias and then away. "Yes, Mistress Mara." That short exchange shifted the temperature in the room. Elias counted out 2 men to carry the ledger section. He did not touch paper. He kept the antique key ring on his belt and watched as others did the labor of removal. His voice never rose, but the command moved through the chamber with the weight of law. "Elias, Mara," and her voice was careful. She used names to slow him. "This is an intake quarter. The entries are thin here. The handwriting is different." Elias did not look at her. "Maintain order. The register is the only proof we hold. When it errs, we correct it. His answer was procedural, auditing in tone. He counted with his fingers before he spoke, then tilted his head toward the table. The way Elias spoke made the process sound like maintenance, but Mara's hands tightened on the scrap, and the motion showed the next emotion shift. Hesitation becoming resolve. She had been trained to treat ink as an instrument of authority. She had also learned that an erased name could end more than a record. It could end a possibility of return. Earlier that month a guard had read the roster aloud and stopped at a blank line where a name should be. He had called number 13. A hollow answer had come from a throat trained to respond when a number mattered more than a person. Mara had heard that hollow answer in Chapter 3. She could hear it again now inside her fingers. Mara slid the scrap into her robust inner seam as a march of men set the bound quarter on the table. The head guard placed coals in a brazier near the door so the fire would be ready. The room's single candle lamps bumped the ledger in thin, precise light. The mood was tight and businesslike. Every motion was intended to limit what anyone could later claim to remember. The second beat of the night arrived when the junior guard delivered the scrap to Mara in the alcove. He offered it like evidence. She studied the faded strokes. The name was smudged at the edges. Someone had tried to press it away with wet cloth. The intake mark, an initial and a tally, matched the kind of notches Mara had been taught to recognize. She kept her voice soft. Mara, the head guard said, bending near the table, we have the mandate. Seal the page. Mara held the scrap and felt its edges cut into her palm. Her hesitation flickered into guilt, then into a small stubbornness, another marked emotion shift. She chose containment. She would pocket the scrap and do the scrape, but she would hide a copy. She made the choice by action. She slid the scrap back into her satchel, under the ledger key, and closed the flap without allowing any man to see what she had done. Elias watched her fingers. Do it, Mara. The command sounded simple. In practice, it was ceremonial. The ledger had been softened earlier. The ink would lift with pressure, and the brass scraper would take it away like a knife taking skin from bone. The head guard pushed the quarter toward her, one scrape for each inked line. Elias points out. Mara set the scraper at the ledger's rim and breathed out slowly. Her chest felt like a held thing. She checked the satchel strap with the corner of her hand and felt the secret scrap folded small inside. That secret made her shoulders rigid. She scraped. The edge rasped. The sound existed in place of speech. The scrape removed letters and slurred the pen stroke where a name had been held. A guard at the iron grill watched faces in the corridor. The prisoners would witness the gesture as part of the ritual. Mara's hand moved in a practiced arc. She blinked and let the next thought take her through muscle memory. She had done this before, and the action moved her through a controlled detachment. But the third emotion shift arrived in the scrape. The rationalization that had kept her alive began to fracture. A junior guard interrupted the motion with a small flinch. Mistress Mara, he said, there's a scrap in the stairwell. Someone moved fast. Mara looked up. Who found it? Harris did. His voice tightened. He says it's sweat. The interruption was external and immediate. An event had occurred between paragraphs. A discovery in the stairwell. It forced an action. Mara pocketed the brass scraper, then lifted the ledger section. The men lifted the quarter, carried it to the brazier, and prepared the small pyre they used to destroy pages marked for removal. The fourth beat, private resistance, occurred in the corridor outside the registry chamber. Mara walked beside Elias but kept a half-step away. The warden's coat hung tight and formal. His pale face showed the thin scar along his jaw. He spoke like a man reading a list. You understand the mandate name is tied to the brass seal. Elias, you will not deviate. Mara's voice was steady. I understand. Warden Elias. He tilted his head and watched her fingers. You have always been precise, Mara. Precision keeps order. She swallowed and did not answer. The words felt like an audit. The head guard walked ahead and opened the iron door to let in the morning's thin light. Mara held the hidden paper against her ribs with the edge of her thumb. Her hesitation hardened into a plan that would risk everything. The next beat revealed a stamped mandate in the sealed vault. Mara moved there with the head guard to retrieve a matching brass seal and confirm the orders. She opened the small chest and pulled a rolled parchment. The stamp bore an official knot and a symbol she recognized from provincial correspondence, the mark that tied the purge to higher authority. The presence of that seal ended any small hope the leger's erasure might be a lone warden's whim. The erasure had backing beyond the prison. Mara's hands trembled as she held the parchment. The tremor showed in her fingers, not in a reflection of guilt. She folded the parchment back and returned it to the chest. The head guard watched her, and his face registered that he had seen her hands shake. He took the chest and shut it with a practiced click. Back at the ledger table, the guards had already begun the ceremonial purge. The head patrol lit the brazier and set a small pile of scraps ready. Prisoners gathered at a distance behind the iron grill. The forgotten, number 13, was dragged in front of the registry to witness the destruction. He had been hooded earlier. The hood came off and revealed a sallow face, a faint tattoo on the wrist, and a pair of dark, sunken eyes. He kept his head low. The room's energy accumulated towards the climax. The cloth of the warden's coat brushed the ledger when he leaned in. He tapped the page with a tiny brass seal and said, "Begin." Mara advanced. The ceremonial erasure was public, designed to make the removal visible and yet make the record true by altering it. The ritual itself bore the weight of law. Inside her, Mara's hesitation asked into another emotion shift, from doubt to defiance to a small, contained fear. She controlled each shift by moving her jaw, by tightening the grip on the scraper, by letting silence grow longer between strokes. Then the mid-chapter cliffhanger came. As Mara placed the scraper to the ledger's surface, the forgotten spoke in a voice that had not been heard in the registry before. "My name," he said, voice raw. Say it. The room froze. The guard's hands shifted on weapons. Elias's fingers stopped counting. The sound of the scrape halted like a pulley. Mara looked at the man's wrist where the faint tattoo showed a name in cramped letters. She felt the scrap inside her satchel like a hot coal. The warden leaned in, lips thin. "Do you see?" He said to the head guard. "They remember. They cling." The head guard barked an order. "Silence him." 2 men stepped forward. The forgotten's chest heaved, but his knees did not buckle. His voice was thin, but it had a deliberate steadiness that made the room small. "Say it," he repeated. "Tell them what you will call me when you burn my name." Mara's mouth was dry. She could have obeyed Elias then, finished the ritual, watched a page reduced to ash and char. Instead, she reached a choice by motion. She placed the hidden scrap on the table beneath the ledger, so that it lay visible for the briefest moment, but still partly covered by the ledger's rim. The action lasted a second. It was the kind of move she had rehearsed in quiet solitude and never in the presence of others. She did not speak. Elias's face clouded. "Mara," he said, "do your duty." She lifted the scraper again. Her hand shook. The scrape came sharp and thin and removed letters in a strip. The sound filled the chamber and then stopped. The head guard took the removed shavings and fed them into the brazier. Smoke rose and the smell of scorched ink moved through the room. Prisoners behind the iron grill made involuntary sounds but did not approach. The warden's posture was relaxed as someone who had balanced risk. The ritual had nearly completed the ledger's removal. But the secret scrap stayed on the table, tiny and folded. A guard who did not expect it shifted to sweep it away. Mara's fingers were quicker. She closed them around the paper and slipped it into a seam in her satchel. The guard blinked and looked away. The action was quick and concrete. It irreversibly changed the evening's official record. The ledger page burned. Officials sealed the charred leaf into an envelope stamped with that same brass seal. The head guard read aloud from the mandate as they burned. The names erased would be recorded as removed to unknown custody. It was a phrase meant to create a legal blank. The prisoners watched. The forgotten stared at Mara and mouthed something that was almost a prayer. Outside the registry chamber, the prisoners resumed their routine. The head patrol marched away with pages tied in cords. Elias remained by the brazier, his profile thin and composed. He let his gaze pass over Mara as if making a mental ledger of behavior. "You kept order, Mara," he said. You kept the ledger. Mara answered with a sentence measured and plain. I kept it whole, Warden Elias. That wording was careful and ambiguous. It did not claim victory. It did not reveal the scrap she had hidden. The warden's eyes narrowed, but he made no further remark. The night's official version would stand. The aftermath was not calm. In the back stairwell, Mara found the Forgotten waiting, wrist bare and small folds of skin clinging to the place where the frayed string had been. He looked at her like a man who had been asked a question his body could not yet answer. Mara, he said, using the one name his lips had learned in the intake. What did you do? Mara put the satchel on the step and opened it. She produced the secret scrap and smoothed the faded ink with the pad of her thumb. The man's eyes shone when he read his own name. You shouldn't have, Mistress Mara, Harris had warned earlier in a corridor. You know what they do to people who hide things. Mara folded the paper into a thin strip and pressed it into his palm. Hide it. Carry it. If anyone asks, you show them the skin. Show them the tattoo. Keep this in your hand until you leave. He smiled with a sudden, broken grin. Mara, her mouth closed. She did not make promises she could not keep. She left him with the scrap and walked the corridors like a woman who had just performed a quiet theft against a system. Her chest still carried tension and the knowledge that the mandate tied the Erasure to powers beyond Elias. The stamped mandate in the sealed vault had made that clear. Her action had been small, but it had to count. The final beat came in the courtyard where officials sealed and partially burned the charred page. Prisoners murmured in small patterns of movement that meant grief and some kind of new, private defiance. The Forgotten stood among them, and when he lifted his hand, he held the scrap folded inside his palm. For the watchers, the ledger was closed. For the men and women who lived behind iron, the ledger's lies had been interrupted by a single human hold. Elias signed the sealed envelope and handed the brass seal to the head guard. The ritual had been completed. He walked past Mara and paused, then said nothing. His step carried the weight of the man who had balanced law and conscience as if they were items in a ledger. Mara did not protest. Her refusal had been a hidden motion. The public record remained intact. In the stairwell later, when the first grey of dawn entered through a narrow slit, Mara unstitched a seam in her satchel and slipped a copy of the scrap into the tiny brass tube she kept for emergency use. She taped it closed and washed her hands under the pump until the wetness did not show. The motions were practical. The emotion that had driven those motions began to settle into something steadier, a quiet, watchful vigilance. The chapter closed on a simple, concrete beat. The ledger had been scraped and burned. Officials affixed their stamps. The Forgotten walked back to a cell with a folded piece of paper secreted in his palm, and Mara watched him go until an iron door closed behind him. She did not speak of destiny or fate. She only tightened the strap of her satchel and went to return the brass scraper to its loop. The warden's small brass seal rested in his hand like a key. The official record had been written in a way that would survive the governor's visits. Mara left the registry chamber holding an action that would matter. She had stolen the state's silence and placed it into a human hand. That act resolved the night's immediate conflict. It also created new risks. The mandate in the sealed vault tied the Erasure to higher authority and made any future discovery lethal. But for the moment the Forgotten had a paper with his name, and the prisoners had watched that name hold in a fist. The final line of the chapter is not a claim about justice. It is a concrete sound. The iron bolt slid home on a cell door, and someone called a name into the dark. Mara heard it and she kept walking.